Dear listener, welcome into Other People's Shoes, Season 17, entitled Dear. This season, we venture into emotional territories as we explore words left unsent through this intimate process of writing a letter that was never meant to reach its recipient. The raw, unfiltered authenticity that speaks volumes in these letters. These unrevealed stories, confessions, and reflections held within these letters until now are powerful. Welcome to Dear. Sincerely, Other People's Shoes.
That is right. Welcome in.
You've got mail.
Welcome. Come on in to Other People's Shoes. I am your host, Neil Matthews. Super excited that you've joined us once again. We are in the final home stretch. As I would say back in my track days, we've hit the corner. Now, if you're a runner and you're a track runner, you know what I mean by hitting the corner. For those non-track runners or maybe the ones that were in the stands cheering loudly while I would run the 3,000, by the way, 7 laps around a 400-meter track, that makes up a 3,000 race. Thank you right now to my mom and wife who endured said race all of those years ago. We have hit the corner. In other words, we're nearing the home stretch of our season 17. And let me tell you, there is part of me that gets very, I don't want to say sad. My wife calls it nostalgic. No, I call it nostalgic. She calls it, what does she call it? Memorable and trinkets and perhaps other names. But we are nearing the end. We have 4 weeks left of this series, and we welcome you into August. It may feel like July still, but I promise you, it is August. And with all that said, I felt like we needed to go someplace perhaps cooler than the raging fires in Southern Oregon currently, and perhaps the really hot weather. Thank you to my brother-in-law for building a pool on the property. One more added amenity that we have here. We can cool off in the pool as we welcome in the hot August nights. And of course, welcome in our new friend from Colorado, my new friend, Nancy. Nancy, how are you today?
Hey, Neil. Thank you so much for having me on today. I ran track as well, and the home stretch is when you give your best. So I'm hoping that these last ones are your best for this.
Well, I'll tell you, I know how the story ends. I'll just say that. That's the joy of podcasting. People make fun of me in some respects a lot, because what happens is that I get an idea in my head, and then that idea starts to grow some legs and some fruition. And then I get with some voice people and I say, okay, hey, here's what I'm thinking. Thank you, ChatGTP, and kind of write a script of how I want the intro to sound. We've kind of gone away from our theme song. We may bring it back. I don't know. It just depends. We've kind of gone away from that. I sit down and I start, again, thinking of people and thinking of guests, and then reaching out to the socials and the things of that nature. And I'm always ahead. So I always have to think in my mind, okay, what is it reality? And then where's the show at? Because they're different. Full disclosure, we're all the way into December.
I have my own podcast as well, and I have 2 of them that are slated for November. I have got a few in August, but then I have this huge gap that I'm like, So yeah, I totally get it.
I do know that gap feeling. As we dig into you and to your story and to life in Colorado, help us with this, though. I'm always curious and love to lead off every show with this question, and that's this. What style of shoe might we find you wearing most days?
I love sandals. Sandals, just any kind of sandal. They're easy to put on. Your feet get to breathe. You don't have the problem with the arch. Just love sandals altogether.
So has there been plantar fasciitis? I practiced that, by the way.
Oh.
Have you ever struggled or dealt with that in any way?
I used to run. I don't anymore. That hurts when you run too much, and then your arch hurts.
I'll tell you, pre-COVID, you can't see them, but along our wall here in the Shoe Shack studios, I actually put up my ribbons, and then over here against the window, there's a window over here, there's these plastic things that my mom actually got me for my shoes, and I've not used them for shoes. I actually have 2 North Carolina helmets hanging on them, and then from below that are my track spikes and then all the medals that I've won. When I look out the window, I get to see those. I did get plantar fasciitis, and I then again practiced it one more time, and it hurts like the dickens. And that's being polite when I say the dickens, because it's debilitating in some respects. I haven't really run a mile though, because I used to run 5Ks and some 10Ks when I was feeling crazy, but I haven't run a 5K in about 3 years. And I think if my life/salvation rested on my ability to run said 5K without walking, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, thankfully it doesn't, right?
Yes, thankfully, it just relies on other things. You are correct. So help us with this, Nancy. As I said, we're rounding the corner. You're part of that kind of home stretch, as we talked about, leading maybe us to home, perhaps foreshadowing what could be coming in our seasons to come, as we're still in this letter writing series, this letter writing season, this this idea of writing a letter to someone, or perhaps a people group, or perhaps a who knows who, but we're writing this letter. Now, you chose to write a letter to whom?
I chose to write it to my grandpa.
And why him?
So my grandpa, he was a storyteller. And I know that you and we obviously both love stories. That's why we're doing what we're doing. He was a storyteller. Just funny and could just catch you. And don't know if they were all true, but it was just fun. Fun, and just people love to listen to those. When I was in college, I went to college to be with a history degree, which is super unhelpful for almost anything. I did most of it in oral history. I wanted to do my grandpa's. I waited too long. He passed away really suddenly when I was in college, or right after college. I had this huge regret of not capturing his stories and his words. And I had done it for other people, and I didn't do it for him. And so this regret forced me, or got me to thinking of, I didn't want to just capture stories. I was doing it for museums and libraries, people that were famous or important enough to have their story captured. I decided I wanted to start a business so that I could capture anyone's stories. Began about 19 years ago as I started Generations to Generations, videotaping people for hours, telling their stories, making it into a book or a DVD so that they can pass it on to their family. And I would say none of them were famous. Probably none of them really went into museums, except for a lot of their military portions. They did go into like the Library of Congress, and I'm very thankful that those were able to be shared with the world in that way. But otherwise, it was just for their family and their friends to have their stories in their words. So I wrote this to my grandpa. He impacted my life in so many other ways, but this is a way that he didn't even realize. I'm sad that he didn't know the even bigger impact that he had on my life and is still having on my life just by being who he was and telling stories. And it sounds kind of silly. I think that's the beauty of life, is that we impact one another in small ways that really do make a big impact. You and I were talking about that, is can we do small things that actually impact and make a difference on others? I believe we can. And that's why I decided to write this to my grandpa that is no longer with us.
What do you miss most about Grandpa?
He was just funny. And he had a lot of little sayings that were probably like inappropriate, kind of, like slightly inappropriate. Like one thing is, I'm going to make it today, actually. It's kind of funny. My mind must have been kind of, I really didn't think of this when I went to the store, but I bought like dried beef or something like that. And you just make a white milk to go with it. And then you put it over toast, or I'm going to put it over biscuits. My grandma showed me this recipe. I mean, it's not difficult at all. And I guess he used to have it when he was in the military because it was very cheap. It's a cheap meal. He used to call it shit on a shingle. And just like little things like that, where you're like, every time you try it, you can't help but say it, even though it's like slightly inappropriate for your children, but you're like, this was just my grandpa. Just little funny things like that just always made you be like, okay.
See, the hard part sometimes I think in life is relatability. And I'm a big hater of this song. I've mentioned it a few times. I'll go ahead and mention it again because this past Sunday, I found myself standing in our church's sanctuary. Our worship team, they're fantastic. They do great work. They practice well. I don't want to say they perform well, but they sing well. I'll say it that way. And lo and behold, I'm standing there, and all of a sudden, the song starts, and I know exactly what song it is. It's Good, Good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's that famous Chris Tomlin song. I am not a fan of that said song. I've actually liked to write to Chris Tomlin and remind him of how dumb his song is.
Oh, no.
And here's why. I have a lot of vitriol and maybe a lot of hatred towards that song. I didn't grow up with this quote unquote good, good father. It wasn't who he was. I will take that a step further to say, in my lifetime, I think I saw my grandfather, my dad's father, 5 times, maybe 7. That might be pushing it. The last memory I have of seeing my grandfather, my mom's father passed away when she was 6 months old. He took his life, so never ever obviously saw him. My brother's 10 and I'm roughly 8-ish, in that range. My grandmother, my granny, dropped us off, pointed in a general direction of where he lives in these rickety old apartments in Coos Bay. And as we walked up these stairs, it was all wood, very old and very termite, maybe infested perhaps. I just remember it being very rickety. As again, little 7-year-old, 8-year-old me, is this going to hold us? It just had that feeling of uneasiness. And we get to the top, and there's a landing and there's a door, and we knock kind of loudly. We hear some rustling and some cursing. And finally, this person emerges from the inside of the apartment. And I remember him wearing like khaki pants and perhaps a white t-shirt with stains on it. And he says, "I paid you last week. What are you doing back here?" My brother and I both look at each other very puzzled, and we said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You're the paper boy, aren't you? I paid you last week. I'm not paying you another dime." I thought, well, there's a story there. Somebody's been maybe hustling him out of paper boy money. And we said, "No, we're your grandkids." And he said, "Well, whose kids are you?" They call my dad Lynn. His first name is Curtis, but they call him Lynn in his family. And we said, "We're Lynn's kids." And he kind of stumbled back. And he said, "Well, you gonna come in?" And I thought, man, that sounds just like my dad. So clearly we've gotten to the right place. And so we come in, and I just remember it being very cluttery, smelled like tobacco. There was alcohol bottles kind of around. I don't know if we sat at the table or not. He quickly went and got us this gigantic, and at the time it was probably very small, but as a young child, it seemed very gigantic thing of Quick, the mixture that you would put into and then make chocolate milk. And I was so excited about this Quick that we got. It's probably expired now knowing more of him and his story, but we didn't care. We were just so excited about the Quick. And again, we didn't stay very long. I don't think we stayed more than 15 minutes. That seems very long. And we left and we walked back to my granny's. Knowing it wasn't that far, it was still a walk back. I do remember that as well. Then we saw him again. We were at Bi-Mart, which is a local kind of grocery store here in Oregon, Northwest. I remember being backseat of my granny's car, and somebody was helping her with her groceries. Why my brother and I didn't help, I still don't know. Maybe we were too young, or she didn't think we could pick up the bags or something. So anyway, this figure was in the back helping her with her groceries, and she got in, and I said, "Oh, Granny," I said, "I'm so sorry. We should have helped you." And she said, "It's okay. Your grandfather helped me." And I said, "Well, who's that?" And she said, "Well, that's him right there. He's leaving." And that was the last time I ever saw of him until many years later. My dad called me one night in somewhat tears, telling me that his dad had died. That was it. And so again, you speak of this grandfather and my maybe juxtaposition of my grandfather's story. Why do you think maybe people struggle with, they didn't have the great grandfather? And I'm not talking the great great grandfather. I'm talking about the great grandfather, a grandfather that was there, the grandfather that nurtured. We've had some come on who have said that, "Hey, I had Pops," as they called him maybe, or Pop, as they have called him. He was amazing. What do you do in moments where people didn't have the good grandfather?
That is so hard. Doing this as long as I've been doing this and as long as you've been doing this, we get to be privy to so many stories. Some of them are really, really wonderful, and some of them are really, really heartbreaking, aren't they? Every time that I hear someone's really heartbreaking story, I feel very grateful for the way I was raised. My parents are still living and they're still married, and not that everything was perfect in any way. There are some really hard stories that people have, that there is this generational kind of blessing or kind of generational curse that you do see. It's really hard to get out of. Whenever I hear someone who has had just a really tough upbringing, has changed their legacy to change their kids' legacy, I also give so much praise for that, because that is really hard. That is really hard to stop that generational of, like, my grandpa wasn't there for me and my dad wasn't there for me. I know this is going to be hard, but I'm going to do something different. I hear so many stories, and I think you can get either really, 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 really sad over them, or you can just be grateful for what you have and pray for the person, and also just be excited when someone does break that generational hurt that keeps on going.
When I hear about people talk about their grandparents or their father or their mother in the loving way that they do articulate it and they do share, it makes me, again, I think it's natural to then start to say, well, how is that different than mine?
Mm-hmm.
I think we talked about this already. I don't like to get political because I think nothing is gained in this environment, especially in the environment that I'm trying to create. But I can't help but think about the Judds song, Grandpa, Tell Me About the Good Old Days. And that song is such an old song. I think appropriate song sometimes. My generation, I'm 44, doesn't really know their grandfathers, their grandparents. Some do. Some are very fortunate and have had that. Others do not. And so it's hard for me to go and maybe campaign that we should be better, we should do better, we should be better, whatever it may be. It starts with us. It starts with us saying, no, we're going to change that story. Or as you mentioned, the business and the idea, which by the way is brilliant. Let me just kudos that right out of the gate, of going out and capturing these stories. Why was that so valuable and so maybe a calling or a burning in your heart or whatever it may be to go and capture those stories, considering we don't remember the good old days of Grandpa?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's important to me because right now there's this huge push towards genealogy. And I think that's great, but I'm not sure that the names and the dates matter as much as a story and who they were, kind of like the dash of between the birth date and the date of death. If we don't know anything about that person, I just don't know that a name all that much matters. Knowing maybe a little bit about who that person was and what they went through, and like your stories, you can go in their shoes and see, hey, what did they do? And I think by looking back a little bit, and we were talking about this at a church, is the future is scary. The future is dark. The future is, you could do your own life, you could do politics, you could do the world, anything. I think most of the time people would say they're more scared or worried about the future. But if we go back in our life, and if we could see something, or if we could see something from our ancestors, if we could see something from the Bible, if we could see something in our past that we were like, yeah, that was a hard time, but I got through it, then that gives me a little bit of relief to face the future. And so I guess that's why one of the reasons I love stories is because they're impactful like that, is that they can remind you of a hard time or even a good time. Maybe you need the reminder of a good time of, oh, I'm feeling really down, or I don't know if I'm making a difference. And you can go back to hey, that person reached out to me and said how much this meant to them. This person told me how much the stories that I tell on my podcast, or capturing their grandpa's story before he passed and how they're learning from it or they're finding comfort from it. And that also makes you ready. We kind of talked off air, I think, about throwing the starfish in. Am I doing anything? Does it matter what I'm doing? And I also think stories, they bring us together. And I think right now in our nation, and we don't have to go into politics on what you believe, in our nation, I hope that most people would agree that we must come together more. This divisiveness is killing us. And if we have a story, if you tell your story, if I tell my story, and we start to relate and be like, oh, you're a human being. Oh, I can see that. Oh, I've been through that. Or gosh, I can really feel for what you're going through. And then later I find out that we disagree on politics. I hope that we could still be friends. I hope that I could still love you and see you as a child of God. And so I think that stories have that ability to unite us.
I absolutely agree. And I think that's the problem, is we're so apt to share and to challenge and to push back. It's like, well, wait a second. Why don't I hear you out first? I've been sharing it every chance I get because it was such an impactful moment. I met this guy named Bill Krause, and he's out of Idaho. He challenged our men of our church at this men's advance. At our church, I always joke that our men don't retreat at our church, we advance. It's kind of a funny, silly thing, perhaps. Some people gravitate to that. I just call it basketball camp because I play a lot of basketball. Bill Krause says, hey, where's the gospel in that? Where's the gospel in that person? Where's the gospel in that customer of yours? Where's the gospel in politics? Where's the gospel? Whatever issue, whatever life you have, whatever facet it may be, where's the gospel in that? And I pulled him aside privately and I thought, Bill, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I was that candid with him. I was like, this is dumb. He's like, Neil, help me. Tell me more of your story so I can better understand you. And I'm like, ooh, I know this line. I use this line. And I said, well, Bill, there's this person, there's this thing, and I start telling him my stuff. And he said, cool. At the end, he was very kind and gracious. He said, where's the gospel in that, Neil? And I said, well, the gospel doesn't fit in there. He said, well, wait a second. The gospel fits in everywhere. Because what is the gospel about? What does it boil down to? And I said, well, it's the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That's the gospel. He said, right. Bigger than that. What is that? I said, well, there's really nothing bigger than that. He said, no, think about it. What was the act of it? And I'm like, grace. He said, oh, what'd you say? I said, grace. He said, there it is. He said, is the gospel in grace? That's what it's about. Is grace in that? That's the gospel. Gospel is grace, right? Yeah. He said, okay, so is the gospel in politics? And I said, well, it needs to be. Hello, yes. He said, great. He said, is the gospel in the person that cut in front of you in line when you're trying to get your latte? Is the gospel in that? And I'm like, yes.
Right.
So in your mind, is the gospel in storytelling?
I think it is. I think this is something I've been really wrestling with actually for a couple of years, is we're told as Christians to evangelize, to share the gospel, to make disciples of all nations. And how do we do that? There has been, I don't know, if you've been in church for a while, maybe you went to a class on how to evangelize, and, that's all well and good. And I think it works for some people. But I think the easier, better, most wonderful way to share the story of Jesus is to share your story. Your story is his glory. If you just share your story about how God's working in your life, no one can, they might disagree with you, but they can't say you're not. It's just your story. They can't say, that's not right. It's not really a point of not agreeing or I don't like that. It's just my story. It's such an easy way for people to see God in you. And the Bible, that's all it is stories. It's stories of how God has worked in people's lives. And he keeps on telling them to remember how I took you out of Egypt. Remember how I brought you to the wilderness. Are we remembering our own stories of how God has worked? And are we sharing that with people? And I think that we can share that with people, and it's an easy way. It's not beating them, the whole thing, beating someone over the head with a Bible. No, you're just sharing of God's love. And what an easy way to show that to the world. And I think that the world is desperate for that. They're just not probably going to go into a church. Would they listen to your story? And I'm not saying you have to, give them the gospel of like, are you going to hell? Are you going to heaven kind of thing. Again, that might work for some people. I think just in general, if we can have a conversation and be like, someone's having a hard time and you're there for them and you kind of meet their needs. Like God says, love God, love people. And you're able to bring them a meal. You're able to send a text. You're able to show these little kindnesses that the world doesn't have right now. And then say, hey, you know what? I've been there before, or I've been there in this situation. And this is how God got me through it. So 100%, I think that our stories are the way that this generation is going to find out about Jesus.
I love what you're saying because, again, it's hard to dispute something that's happened to you personally.
Right.
Now, again, I've heard a number of stories in podcasting, upwards of almost 300 now. We're closing in. And there have been some stories that I'm like, man, I don't know. But again, it's their story. Mm-hmm. I might not agree with it, but it is their story. It is what happened to them. Mm-hmm. Now, again, the big pushback on that could be the cynic in the room would say, well, Neil, feelings aren't facts. We can't just base our whole life on our feelings because we might get wrong directions. Absolutely agree on some level with that. However, I cannot dispute something happened to that person. I can't. I just can't. Mm-hmm. Whether I think it happened or not doesn't matter. They believe it is their truth, and I'm choosing that, their truth. That's the hard part. So I want to get to this little thing here. I met one of the members of this amazing group back in the early 90s, maybe even late 90s. They were around this group called For Him. I met one of the members, Andy Chrisman. He actually came on our show. But there's another member in the group who broke away from the group, or when the group dissipated, he took on his own career, and his name's Mark Harris. So one of the members of For Him wrote this song, The Line Between the Two. And it made me think about you in this moment and what you do and what you capture. The chorus of the song goes as such. It says, and the years go by and they seem to fly and they'll all be over soon. When our life is done, did we live in love the way we wanted to? Because every day that we leave behind goes on to tell the truth of how we lived in the line between the two. The idea of the line in between the two dates, as you were mentioning, or the 2 years.
Right.
Why do you think that's so important for us to really focus on how we're living in the line between the two?
Yeah. These are great questions. And I even brought it up, the line between your birthday and the day that you pass. Sometimes that gets to be a little bit too much time for me. I have been struggling and working on smaller times, and I think it still goes to what we're talking about is, am I so busy in my day that I don't have any breath, any median, any time if something comes up, if someone says, hey, I'm in the hospital, can you come and see me? My daughter got this terrible diagnosis. Could you bring me a meal, or could you be here for my other kids? And these are things that have all happened in the last month. I could say so many more. There's so much people that are hurting. This world has so much going on. Am I someone that can take the time of, yes, I can bring you a meal. Yes, I can stop at the hospital. Yes, I can do that. And obviously not every day is going to allow that, but in general, are my weeks so jam-packed that I don't have a minute to actually look at my kids and, hey, how are you doing? Or to take the extra time when I'm checking out at Walmart to let someone go ahead of me? Or am I so rushed that I am frantic and I get so upset about someone that cuts me off because I'm going to be late because I have no time in my schedule for anything. That's what I've been really thinking of, is because I think that dash in the middle is a good thought, but I also think sometimes it's just way too big of okay, that's great. How am I going to live my whole however many years I have? But if we can take it down to a day or a week of, do I have time to see someone that just needs hey, how are you doing? Or when I go to Home Depot and things don't go well because they don't, and I need help and someone's not there, but I only have 30 minutes. I'm starting to get angry at people. Or can I take the time and be like, this kind of stinks. I'm still going to treat people with kindness because I am not so driven, so jam-packed that I don't have the bandwidth to love others.
I've been doing carnivore, which is just strictly eating meat, eggs, and no cheese, and just drinking water. I've actually eliminated almost all coffee from my life. I did treat myself to some coffee a couple of weeks back. It was a treat rather than a everyday occurrence. I went to In-N-Out, which is one of the famous West Coast restaurants. Sorry if you don't have an In-N-Out. Oregon got one, I think 5-7 years ago, somewhere in that time frame. I went in there to just get their patties. That's all I wanted. That's all I ordered. The lady actually did not throw too much rocks at me for wanting to do that. She's like, okay, all right, how many you want? Okay, great. So I leave, get my ticket and leave. And as I'm leaving, I noticed that there's another individual walking up, a lady, and she seems to be hearing impaired. I can kind of see the hearing aids in her ears. And she even says to the lady taking orders, she says, I don't hear very well in these loud environments. Can you make eye contact with me when my food's ready and I'll come up? I might not hear you because it's so loud in here. Mm-hmm. Just kind of watching her after that. I kind of noticed that interaction and I'm watching her. Sure enough, they call my food, and shortly after then they call hers. And she's just standing there and they're trying to like call it a couple of times. And I finally was like, you know what? All right, let's do this. And so I walked up to her and I kind of tapped her on the shoulder and she turned to me very startled. And I said, I'm sorry. I said, number 6, because that's what she was. And I held up 6 fingers and I said, number 6. And she nodded and I said, mouth the words very slowly. Your food is at the counter. And she looked at me and went up to the counter very reluctantly, but went up to the counter, showed the lady the ticket, and the lady gave her food. And as she left, she signed to me, thank you. And I signed back, thank you. I'm not American Sign Language expert. I know a few things, probably not very many. How many people would have taken the moment, taken the time? It's my lunch hour, so I only had an hour. Talk about that window of time, that dash time. How many people would have taken that moment, that extra time to be aware of the surroundings of that? And so that, I guess that would be my challenge, is how do we become more aware of what's around us to maybe be less angry at Home Depot? I'm always angry at Home Depot because I'm not a man guy like that. I go to Home Depot and I'm intimidated because they're like, hey, what kind of hammer do you need? I'm like, I don't even know what a hammer looks like, bro. He's like, how about some work gloves? I'm like, that sounds awesome because these hands were not made for manual labor.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I have 3 questions at the end of my podcast. 1 is, what's your favorite Bible verse or story? 2, what are you grateful for? Because I think when we get a sense of gratefulness, then we just change our perspective on life. And then my last one is, what kindness have you received or shown in the last week? And that's exactly what I'm getting at, is these small acts of kindness that actually make such a big difference. I have found that for most people, they'll share something that happened to them, which is super wonderful. We are so afraid to say something that we've done. I might be bragging. And it's so sad. I agree. If I say something like that, I'm like, you know what? I did this for someone. And you're like, but I don't want to brag. I think people know when it's bragging and when it's not, first of all. And maybe we need to share more about, hey, this was something small I did that made a difference, because we wonder, do we have to pay off someone's whole house? Do we have to buy someone a new car in order to make a difference? No. Let's share sometimes of what someone's did for us, or if we're bold enough to share about something that we did for someone else. And yes, it might not have been a big deal to you, but it seems like it was a big deal to that person. I think sometimes even saying, I see you. How much of the times in our life are we on our phone and we don't even look at people around when we go to the store? We don't even make eye contact. We're not even I couldn't tell you if, oh, that person even walked by me. That's not good. We need to be a little bit more engaged with one another and be able to take 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 30 seconds and help someone out and be okay sharing that. So I love that you shared that story.
I'm not perfect at it. I'm sure I've had many, many misses. I go back to Bill's haunting statement is, where is the gospel in that? That is what you talk about, wrestling with things. That's what I continue to wrestle with, is where's the gospel in that? Now, again, I could have just minded my own business. I could have kept to myself. It's not my place. It's not my fault. She's a young woman. She's by herself. I'm a guy by myself. I mean, the dynamics are there. It's a public environment. It's not like anything creepy is going to go on. Still, there is that weirdness or that awkwardness. And to me, again, it goes back to the fact of, what are we here for? Like, what are we here for? And maybe that's the part that I keep pushing myself on and challenging myself on is, the harder they are in my life, whoever they are, the more I feel like I need to stop and say, okay, here we go. Where's the gospel in that? And where's the forgiveness in that? And where's the grace in that?
Yeah. And I think that, whoever your people are that you're like, ugh. And maybe it's a specific person. I think we all have that in our lives. If we can, though, see them as a person or get to know them a little bit better, some of those walls just start to fall down. And that doesn't mean you're going to be best friends or you have to be best friends. The thing that people think is, oh, well, that means I have to hang out with them all the time or agree with them on everything. No, that doesn't mean that. It just means that you're seeing them as another human being and giving them respect, loving them like Jesus would love them, and not just having a judgment against them. That doesn't mean you have to hang out every Friday night. To start stopping those, I guess, breaking down those walls, I think is so important. And I think that our cities, our homes, our nation could really be different if we just saw each other like people.
And I think that's, again, you talk about unifying this world. You talk about bringing it together. Can I set whatever it is aside? Maybe it's a habit. Maybe it's a hang up that I might have with somebody. Can I set that aside and still extend a hand? Can I still extend kindness? Somebody said to me once, kindness is free. And I said, well, is it though? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's kind of like grace. I think it's free to the person who's getting it, but to the person who gave it, it costs something. And that's what makes it so beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. Help me with this. Why do your show? I mean, we kind of have hovered around it a little bit, I feel like. What was really the catalyst or maybe the genesis moment that you're like, okay, I have something here. I have this thing that needs to now happen. What was that for you?
I've had my business for 19 years, generations to generations, where I get big stories, hours of stories for people, make books and DVDs. And about 3 years ago, I went to a women's conference. They had just done a worship song, and then they're like, hey, get into groups and pray together. And I'm an introvert. I know I do podcasts. I talk to people. I'm an introvert. So I was like, I'm going to leave. I don't want to be here. But I just felt like, no, just get into the group. And they said, just say one word. So everyone went around and said one word. And I was the last person. And I felt like God was saying, I have put something on your heart. You need to share this. So I said, I feel like I'm supposed to start a podcast. It's supposed to be called Ordinary People, Extraordinary Things, talking to ordinary people about faith and hope. And I mean, it was very clear. I already had so much of it down on what it was supposed to be. I said, I don't have time. So that's one thing we've been talking about. And the other thing was, I'm afraid to fail. What if I start and no one listens or 2 people listen? And I've put myself out there. That was the biggest thing. It wasn't really about time. You can always make time for what's important. It was about failing. I said that. I actually said, God, I don't want to hear you. I put my hands over my ears. I didn't want to hear from God about what I was supposed to do. So we prayed. This lady walked on. Her name's Allie Worthington. She lives in a different state. Never met her before. Her whole thing was, if God's calling you, you got to do it. And I was like, oh my goodness, like, okay. And then it got more precise, though. She said, God, I don't want to hear you. And she put her hands over her ears and she said those exact words. Everyone who I had been praying with, and I think that's why I was supposed to pray with people, was that they would see also. And it wouldn't just be in my head of like, well, I kind of thought I said that. Oh, yeah. It was so overt. And everyone was like, what happened? We've never heard God speak to someone so clearly. And so I went out to Allie afterwards and briefly told her the story. And she said, I've never said those words or done that motion before. That was for you. I got in the car, called my husband, told him. He's like, great. And I was like, not you too? Like, you don't want to give me some pushback of, no, you don't have time for that? Or a month later, I started. It's been almost 3 years for that. If you are this, I guess this is what I would say, is if you feel like you're supposed to do something, no matter how crazy it sounds or whatever your obstacles are, I think you should do it. And it might not mean that you're #1 podcast. That's not what it means. It means that you are throwing those starfish in. It means that you are making a small difference, that you are doing what you're supposed to do.
Your story is way cooler than mine. Starting a podcast, by the way. Wow.
Why did you start yours?
Oh, I just have an amazing wife who said, you need a verbal outlet and I'm not it. Maybe it's time you start a show. Well, how can people go and listen? How can people connect with you? Maybe on the business side of things and on the show side of things. What's the best way people can reach out to you if they want to know more about the business and the generational stories you're getting and gathering?
Oh, yeah, thank you. So Generations to Generations, generations with an S and TO for 2, generations2generations.com. That's the easiest one for my business. And I do have a podcast link up there. People extraordinary, like a silhouette of a woman with a sunrise background. And you can find me on Facebook, X, Instagram, all the places.
Do you have one social media you like more than another?
I like Instagram a little bit better.
I've only been on X a lot more recently because of the election season, and it seems to be they get news faster than, say, the others.
I know.
So I've been checking X like faithfully, just down scroll. And I love to see what's trending, to see what in the world is going on. Sometimes it's depressing. Sometimes it's like, whoa, okay. Or like if a major sporting event's going on, it's fun. If your letter to Grandpa had a PS to it, what would it be?
You have good questions. I would say, no matter if you think you have a story or not, if you're afraid to share, if you don't think anyone will care, you do have a story. Share your story.
That was lovely. I love that. Well, again, Nancy, thank you so much for giving up some moments today. We really appreciate it. We really value what you shared. And I really think there is, again, as we've echoed throughout this, there is power in the story. It's up to us whether we want to write it or speak it, but there is power in that story.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on, and thank you for what you do, how you are changing the perspectives, just trying to make that switch just by having someone share their story. And I think that's so powerful. I think it's so needed. I appreciate what you're doing.
All right, guys and gals, kids and campers alike, that is it. That is all. That is our show. I get intimidated by the blank page. I do. It doesn't matter if it's a sticky note. It doesn't matter if it's the back to school section at Walmart. With all those notebooks, it's scary. It's daunting, downright petrified. It gives me just anxiety and angst. And here's why. There's just this feeling I get, and maybe I'm alone in this. I probably am. I'm a little peculiar. Do you ever get it? This overwhelming feeling to fill the page. So I'm wondering about that for you today is what really needs to be on the page? What in your life maybe needs to be erased? And really hone in on okay, this is the moment where I sit down and I hone in on those things and really make those things the most important things. I haven't had time for this. I haven't had time for that. Okay. Maybe this is the moment as September comes to say, okay, August, I'm going to give myself a breather. I'm going to get organized. Come September, I'm going to be ready. Let me know if you do that. I'd love to know. OPSpodcast.com is a great place to let me know. You can let us know on the socials at OPS Podcast Show on our Facebook, Instagram, and X. You can also just drop us a voicemail. That's fun too. Don't forget this as we go. Remember, as Mufasa would say, remember. When you walk in other people's shoes, you really do get a different perspective on life. Thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned till next week as we walk in other people's shoes.